chosen one, listen carefully. This message isn't an accident. God is preparing something you never saw coming. There is a dangerous assumption that many intelligent people make. We believe that the greatest threats to our lives will appear obviously evil. We imagine destruction arriving with unmistakable warning signs, dramatic betrayals, or undeniable darkness. Yet history, scripture, and human experience reveal something far more unsettling. The most devastating influences rarely introduce themselves as enemies. They arrive looking like answers. They wear familiar faces, speak comforting words, and awaken desires that seem entirely reasonable. This is why one of God's greatest acts of mercy is not giving us everything we ask for, but quietly preventing us from receiving what would ultimately destroy us. Perhaps you have been wondering why certain doors keep closing, why one particular person remains just out of reach, why every attempt to revive a relationship seems to collapse no matter how much effort you invest. It is tempting to interpret these moments as evidence that God has abandoned you. But what if the opposite is true? What if every unanswered prayer, every unexpected delay, and every painful separation is not heaven's rejection, but heaven's protection? What if God is not keeping you from your happiness, but keeping your happiness from being consumed by someone who would slowly break your spirit? Human beings have a remarkable ability to confuse desire with destiny. We often believe that because we feel something intensely, it must therefore be right. Yet emotion is not the same as wisdom. A thirsty traveler can mistake a mirage for water. A lonely heart can mistake attention for love. And a wounded soul can mistake familiarity for safety. Our deepest vulnerabilities often become the very places where deception appears most convincing. The tragedy is not simply that we choose the wrong people. The tragedy is that we sometimes defend the very relationships from which God is trying to rescue us. This reveals something profound about the psychology of attachment. Once we have imagined a future with someone, our minds begin protecting that vision. We overlook contradictions, excuse unhealthy patterns, and reinterpret warning signs until they seem insignificant. We become less interested in discovering the truth than in preserving the story we desperately want to believe. Fear of losing the relationship becomes greater than fear of losing ourselves. Long before our hearts are broken, our discernment has already begun to weaken. Faith interrupts this dangerous pattern. It does not ask us to ignore our emotions, nor does it encourage suspicion toward every relationship. Instead, faith teaches us to trust that God's perspective reaches beyond the limits of our own understanding. What appears cruel in the moment may, in time, reveal itself as extraordinary compassion. C.S. Lewis often reminded readers that God is more concerned with our eternal good than our temporary comfort. The divine physician is willing to perform painful surgery if it means preserving the life of the patient. In much the same way, God will sometimes remove a person from your path because he sees wounds they have not yet inflicted and burdens you have not yet carried. Perhaps the greatest danger is not the person themselves, but what remaining with them would gradually transform you into. Every relationship shapes the soul. The people closest to us influence our character, our beliefs, our peace, and even our understanding of God. Some relationships call forth the best within us. Others slowly erode our confidence, distort our identity, and leave us emotionally exhausted. Without us realizing how much we have changed, destruction rarely happens all at once. More often, it unfolds through small compromises repeated over time until we no longer recognize the person we have become. So before you grieve another closed door, consider a possibility that pride often refuses to entertain. Perhaps God has been answering your prayers in a way you never expected. Perhaps the name you keep chasing is the very name heaven is trying to remove from your future. And perhaps what feels like unbearable loss today will one day become the evidence that God's greatest miracle was not bringing that person into your life, but mercifully keeping them out. There comes a moment in nearly every person's life when they begin negotiating with reality instead of accepting it. They know somewhere deep within themselves that a relationship is unhealthy. They recognize the repeated disappointments, the subtle manipulation, the growing absence of peace. Yet instead of asking whether they should remain, they begin asking how they can make it work. This shift is more significant than it first appears, because it reveals that the heart has stopped pursuing truth and started protecting attachment. The relationship becomes less about what is good and more about what is familiar. This is where many people misunderstand the nature of God's guidance. They expect Him to intervene only through dramatic miracles or unmistakable voices from heaven. Yet God often guides by quietly removing what would eventually destroy us. He closes doors that our emotions desperately try to reopen. He allows circumstances to fall apart that our desires keep trying to rebuild. From a human perspective, these moments feel like failure. From God's perspective, they are often acts of extraordinary mercy. Scripture repeatedly demonstrates this pattern. God's protection frequently arrives in forms that initially appear painful. Joseph was sold into slavery before becoming the instrument of preservation for an entire nation. Moses spent decades in the wilderness before leading Israel to freedom. Even the disciples often misunderstood the purpose behind Christ's delays, only realizing later that what seemed confusing was actually essential. The lesson is remarkably consistent. God's wisdom cannot always be judged by immediate comfort. Sometimes His greatest blessings begin as our greatest disappointments. Psychology offers an interesting parallel. Researchers describe something known as confirmation bias, the tendency to notice evidence that supports what we already believe while ignoring evidence that challenges it. This does not merely influence political opinions or everyday decisions, it profoundly shapes relationships. Once we convince ourselves that someone belongs in our future, our minds begin filtering reality through that assumption. Their kindness becomes proof they have changed. Their apologies become promises of transformation. Their moments of affection erase months of neglect. Gradually, we stop seeing the person as they truly are and begin seeing the version we desperately hope they will become. This is why discernment requires more than intelligence. Brilliant people make disastrous relationship decisions every day because wisdom is not measured by intellectual ability. Wisdom is measured by the willingness to accept uncomfortable truth. Pride says, I can fix this person. Fear says, I may never find anyone else. Loneliness whispers, something is better than nothing. But faith asks an entirely different question. What is God trying to protect me from? That question changes everything. Instead of viewing obstacles as enemies, you begin considering whether they are boundaries established by divine love. Instead of assuming every delay is punishment, you begin wondering whether preparation is taking place beyond your sight. Instead of obsessing over why someone left, you begin asking what part of your future God refused to surrender to someone who could not be trusted with it. C.S. Lewis frequently explored the idea that our perspective is painfully limited compared with God's eternal vision. A child may resent a parent for preventing them from touching fire because they cannot yet comprehend the danger. The parent's refusal feels restrictive, even unfair. Yet the refusal is not rooted in cruelty. It is rooted in knowledge. In much the same way, many of God's refusals are expressions of perfect love. He sees consequences that remain hidden from us. He understands conversations that have not yet happened, betrayals that have not yet unfolded, and wounds that have not yet been inflicted. His no is often the visible expression of invisible compassion. Perhaps this explains why some relationships seem impossible to sustain despite every effort. Every time you try to rebuild them, another obstacle appears. Every attempt at reconciliation ends with the same cycle of disappointment. Every promise of change slowly fades back into familiar patterns. We often interpret this repetition as evidence that we simply need greater perseverance. But perseverance is not always faith. Sometimes perseverance is merely refusal to release what God has already removed. One of the most dangerous illusions is believing that persistence automatically makes something righteous. It does not. A person can spend years pursuing the wrong relationship with remarkable dedication. Commitment alone is not proof of God's approval. Even sincere prayers can be directed toward unhealthy desires if those desires arise from fear rather than trust. God does not bless every attachment simply because it feels important to us. He blesses what leads us toward truth, peace, and spiritual maturity. This requires enormous humility because letting go often feels like admitting defeat. Yet perhaps surrender is not defeat at all. Perhaps it is the highest expression of trust. To release someone God keeps removing is to declare that His wisdom matters more than your immediate emotions. It is to believe that temporary pain is preferable to permanent regret. And it is to accept that the God who created your heart understands its future better than your heart understands itself. So if there is a name you cannot seem to stop repeating, a relationship you cannot stop trying to resurrect, or a door you cannot stop trying to force open, pause before making one more attempt. Ask yourself whether your determination is truly leading you toward peace, or merely keeping you attached to a future that God, in His mercy, has already decided to protect you from. For sometimes the greatest miracle is not that God gives us what we want. Sometimes the greatest miracle is that He lovingly refuses to let us keep what would have broken us forever. One of the most difficult truths to accept is that the greatest danger in a relationship is not always what another person does to you. Sometimes the greater danger is what remaining with that person slowly does to you. Character is rarely destroyed overnight. Identity does not disappear in a single conversation. The soul erodes gradually, almost imperceptibly, through countless small compromises that seem insignificant on their own. That is why God's warnings are often quiet. He is not only concerned with the pain you may experience today, He is protecting the person you are becoming tomorrow. We often imagine heartbreak as a dramatic event, a betrayal, a painful goodbye, or an unexpected ending. But there is another kind of heartbreak that receives far less attention. It is the heartbreak of slowly losing yourself while trying to keep someone else. It happens when your peace becomes dependent on another person's approval. It happens when you begin walking on emotional eggshells, carefully measuring every word to avoid conflict. It happens when your joy rises and falls according to their mood rather than your relationship with God. At first, these changes seem harmless. Over time, they reshape your entire identity. This is why Scripture consistently emphasizes guarding the heart. The biblical command is not merely poetic language, it reflects a profound understanding of human nature. Whatever repeatedly enters the heart eventually influences the mind, the will, and the character. Every close relationship becomes a classroom. Whether we realize it or not, we are constantly learning from the people nearest to us. We absorb their attitudes, imitate their habits, adopt their priorities, and slowly begin seeing the world through their perspective. This is why choosing the wrong companion is never a small decision. It is a decision about who will help shape the person you become. Modern psychology supports this reality in remarkable ways. Human beings are deeply influenced by emotional environments. Researchers have long observed that attitudes, behaviors, and even emotional patterns spread through close relationships almost like invisible currents. Spend enough time around chronic negativity, and hope begins to feel unrealistic. Live under constant criticism, and confidence slowly disappears. Remain in an environment where manipulation is normalized, and eventually you begin questioning your own perception of reality. The most dangerous influence is often the one that feels normal because it has been present for so long. This is precisely why God's warnings are often subtle before they become unmistakable. Rarely does He begin by shouting. More often, He whispers through your conscience. You notice an uneasiness after certain conversations. You sense that something feels spiritually unsettled, even though you cannot fully explain why. Small inconsistencies begin appearing between words and actions. Promises become excuses. Respect slowly gives way to control, Peace quietly disappears, replaced by constant anxiety. None of these moments seem dramatic enough to justify leaving, yet together they form a pattern that wisdom cannot afford to ignore. C.S. Lewis frequently suggested that every choice, no matter how ordinary it appears, shapes the kind of person we are becoming. We are never standing still. Every decision moves us toward greater likeness to truth or further into self-deception. Relationships accelerate this process because they touch the deepest parts of our emotional and spiritual lives. The people closest to us either encourage courage, honesty, and faithfulness, or they gradually cultivate fear, compromise, and confusion. There is no neutral ground. Every relationship leaves its mark upon the soul. Perhaps this explains why God sometimes removes people before we fully understand the reason. He is not merely responding to what they have already done. He is responding to what continued influence would eventually produce. He sees habits forming before they become addictions. He sees discouragement growing before it becomes despair. He sees compromises multiplying before they become a completely different way of life. His timing often feels premature to us because we judge by present circumstances, while he judges by future consequences. There is another subtle danger we rarely acknowledge. Sometimes we become so committed to saving another person that we neglect saving ourselves. Compassion is a beautiful quality, but compassion without wisdom becomes self-destruction. We convince ourselves that if we love harder, forgive longer, or sacrifice more deeply, everything will eventually change. Yet, genuine love cannot flourish where truth is continually rejected. God never asked you to abandon wisdom in the name of compassion. He calls you to love others, but never at the cost of losing the identity He created within you. The enemy of your soul understands this principle well. He does not always seek to destroy your faith through dramatic rebellion. Often he is content to slowly distract you, exhaust you, and fill your life with relationships that consume your spiritual energy until your passion for God quietly fades. A heart rarely drifts away from God all at once. It drifts one compromise at a time, one unhealthy attachment at a time, one ignored warning at a time. That is why discernment is one of the greatest expressions of spiritual maturity. Discernment is not suspicion. It is not cynicism. It is the quiet ability to recognize whether a relationship consistently leads you closer to God's peace or further away from it. Ask yourself honest questions. Are you becoming more patient or more anxious? More truthful or more fearful? More secure in God's love or more dependent on another person's validation? The answers reveal far more than emotions ever could. So if God has been making it increasingly difficult for one particular relationship to continue, resist the urge to interpret every obstacle as something to overcome. Sometimes obstacles are not barriers placed in your way. Sometimes they are boundaries placed around your future. And one day, when you look back with clearer eyes, you may discover that the greatest act of love God ever showed you was not allowing that person to stay long enough to change you into someone you were never meant to become. There is a quiet irony at the heart of the human experience. We often pray for God to bless us, while refusing to release the very thing standing between us and that blessing. We ask Him to lead us into a better future, yet our hands remain tightly wrapped around a past He has already asked us to surrender. We call this faithfulness, perseverance, or loyalty. But sometimes it is neither. Sometimes it is simply fear wearing the mask of devotion. We fear that if we let go of the wrong person, nothing better will ever come. Yet faith has always required open hands, because God cannot place something new into a life that refuses to release what no longer belongs there. One of the greatest misconceptions about loss is that it is always evidence of failure. We naturally assume that if something ended, it must have been meaningless. But Scripture consistently tells a different story. Throughout the Bible, God often removed people, places, and seasons before introducing something greater. Abraham had to leave the familiar before entering the Promised Land. Ruth had to endure devastating loss before she encountered Boaz. The disciples left behind careers, security, and certainty before discovering the purpose for which they had been created. In every case, surrender came before fulfillment. This reveals a profound spiritual principle. God is not merely interested in changing your circumstances. He is interested in transforming your capacity to receive what He has prepared. A blessing given to an unprepared heart often becomes a burden. Success without character produces pride. Love without maturity produces dependence. Opportunity without wisdom produces waste. This is why God sometimes delays what you desire. The delay is not punishment, it is preparation. We prefer the pain we already understand over the uncertainty we cannot control. Even unhealthy relationships can become strangely comforting simply because they are familiar. The mind often mistakes familiarity for safety. We cling to what hurts us because at least we know what to expect. The unknown, even when it contains something infinitely better, feels frightening because it requires trust. This is one of the enemy's most subtle strategies. He convinces us that letting go means losing everything, but God repeatedly teaches the opposite lesson. In His kingdom, release often comes before renewal. Seeds must fall into the ground before they produce life. Winter must pass before spring can reveal its beauty. Even Christ Himself demonstrated that resurrection could only follow surrender. What appears to be an ending is often heaven preparing a beginning that could not exist any other way. C.S. Lewis frequently reflected on the idea that God does not remove our lesser joys because He delights in deprivation. He removes them because they often prevent us from receiving greater ones. A child may become furious when a parent takes away a sharp object, unable to understand that the loss is actually protection. The child sees only what has been taken away. The parent sees the injury that never happened. We often approach God in much the same way. We grieve over what He has removed, unaware that He is grieving over what would have happened had He allowed it to remain. Consider how often your greatest growth has followed your greatest disappointment. The job you lost forced you toward a calling you never would have pursued. The friendship that ended revealed strengths you never knew you possessed. The season of loneliness taught you to depend upon God in ways comfort never could. At the time, each experience felt like unnecessary suffering. Looking back, however, you recognize that those painful moments became the very foundation upon which your future was built. The same principle applies to relationships. The person whose absence now feels unbearable may actually be creating space for the peace you have been praying to receive. Every unhealthy attachment occupies emotional, mental, and spiritual energy. It fills your thoughts, directs your decisions, and shapes your expectations. As long as that space remains occupied by the wrong person, it becomes difficult to recognize the right opportunities God quietly places before you. Sometimes God is not delaying your blessing, He is clearing away the obstacles that would prevent you from recognizing it. This requires extraordinary courage, because surrender is rarely celebrated in the moment. The world praises those who refuse to give up, who chase relentlessly, and who fight until they win. Yet spiritual maturity teaches another kind of courage, the courage to stop pursuing what God is no longer blessing. There is strength in perseverance, but there is also strength in surrender. Knowing when to continue and when to release requires a heart that trusts God's wisdom more than its own emotions. Ask yourself an honest question. If God revealed today that the person you keep pursuing was never part of His plan for your future, would you have the courage to let go? Or would you continue fighting for a future He never intended you to have? The answer exposes where your trust truly rests. Faith is not measured by how passionately you pursue your desires. It is measured by how willingly you surrender them when God's direction becomes clear. Perhaps this is why some prayers remain unanswered, not because God is indifferent, but because He loves you too deeply to grant every request. His refusal is not evidence of distance, it is evidence of wisdom. He sees beyond your present emotions into consequences you cannot yet imagine. He knows the conversations that would have wounded you, the betrayals that would have shattered your peace, and the compromises that would have quietly stolen your identity. His no protects the yes he has prepared for the future. So if you find yourself grieving someone whose name still echoes through your thoughts, remember this: your story is not defined by who walked away or who could not stay. Your story is defined by the God who refused to let your future be built upon a foundation that could never sustain it. And one day, when his purpose becomes visible, you will discover that what once felt like unbearable loss was actually the first chapter of your greatest blessing.